Hi everyone! AI labs around the world are in a race to build the most powerful models possible, often prioritizing speed to market over safety. This dynamic, known as Moloch's trap, risks potentially catastrophic consequences for humanity. Efforts like the Pause AI letter from March 2023 have called for caution, but so far, no one has managed to slow the race. However, there's hope that coordination might be achieved through hardware controls built directly into GPUs. Keep watching to learn more. This video has 3 parts: sacrifices to Moloch, why a geopolitical treaty is needed, and hardware-enabled governance. Part 1. Sacrifices to Moloch. Moloch is the name of an ancient Carthaginian demon, historically associated with the sacrifice of precious things. The name would probably just be an obscure footnote in history, except that it has been resurrected to talk about a situation that happens in game theory, which is called the race to the bottom. I first encountered the term from Max Tegmark's interview on Lex Fridman's podcast, but I think the original source is Medications on Moloch, which I'll link to in the description below. Here's an example taken from that article. Let's say you're one of the first rats that is introduced to a pristine new island. You have a great life, you eat well, you have lots of kids, and you even have some spare time to spend making art. I know it's a little silly, but it's the example, just run with it. After the first generation of rats has passed on, successive generations keep having larger and larger families until the population reaches a maximum, say like 10,000, where food is actually the limiting factor. At that point, some rats abandon artistic pursuits in favor of just spending more time looking for food. Eventually, they would outcompete every other group, and so rat art would vanish. If one group of rats decides to altruistically have at most 2 kids to avoid rats from starving to death, then that group will also die out eventually, as they're outcompeted by the rats that don't observe any such constraint. Even if one group of rats notices that all the nuts are disappearing and there's about to be a mass starvation event, and they start limiting their own food income as a result, they will still get outcompeted because not every rat will feel obliged to follow this same paradigm. So here you have a statement that every rat would agree with, which is we should maintain a low enough population that no rat has to starve. But from within the system, each individual rat will follow its own self-interest, and the island will have an endless boom-bust cycle. In examples like these, the negative outcomes are a property of the whole system. If one rat asked another, who is doing this? There isn't anyone to blame. It's an emergent property of the whole system. And that's where Moloch comes in. It's a tongue-in-cheek answer to the question of who is doing this. You can say, it's Moloch doing this. Moloch, the ancient Carthaginian demon. It's a personification of negative feedback cycles in a system. For a modern example, let's say there are some capitalist companies that are competing over a new product. If one company gets an edge and develops some dangerous technology that nevertheless helps them, they could decide to delay the release of that technology altruistically, but they'll start falling behind as soon as someone else also develops that technology. So eventually they would have to release it anyway, as soon as there was competition. And yes, this is a real example about Google holding back the release of LLMs. As soon as ChatGPT was released, Moloch took hold of AI development. Everyone is incentivized to work faster, to develop research faster, to get products faster, essentially competing for the future resource of all AI capability. After all, if you have $1 billion and you want to make 100x profit on it, you're going to be very strict with the AI companies that you've invested in. That's the capitalism angle, and this might just be all business as usual if all the impacts were economic ones. But there is a strong safety issue as well. As companies go faster, they have more opportunities to make mistakes and indirectly cause harm, as customers use their very general purpose tools to cause harm in the world. We can all agree objectively that this is not a good situation. But even if one company wants to be responsible, limiting their own actions doesn't change anything except mean that they will be outcompeted by everybody else, because Moloch still applies pressure on everyone. Here's a quote from Meditations on Moloch. Once one agent learns how to become more competitive by sacrificing a common value, all its competitors must also sacrifice that value or be outcompeted and replaced by the less scrupulous. Therefore, the system is likely to end up with everyone once again equally competitive, but the sacrificed value is gone forever. Looking at this from the machine learning lens, capitalism is undergoing optimization pressure. Companies are optimizing pretty much a single variable, which is profit. And just as it can be dangerous to apply optimization to a model when the optimization function is not perfectly aligned with what you want. We now have everyone optimizing for profit, and then we act surprised when forests get cut down and rivers polluted and child labor exploited, etc., etc. This is just an inherent property of the system of Moloch. Part 2. Why a geopolitical treaty is needed. I talked about AI labs and companies racing for better technology, but it's not just companies that are in this race. Governments are in it as well. AI has become a resource, and countries compete over resources. In the absence of a world government, or of the US acting sufficiently like global police, each country has to look out for themselves. The result is strictly worse equilibria, or actual states. It would be one thing if this was about territorial division, but it's another if it's about potentially existential risks to humanity. Yet, no country can do anything to change the situation from within the system. The whole system has to change. In other words, rules have to be enforced on everybody from the outside. This would be a more straightforward problem if all of the parties that needed regulation were in a single country, in a single economy, because then you could just pass one set of laws and be done with it. But we're not talking about the economy of just one country. We're talking about a global race between the US, China, Europe, and others who all have frontier AI models of various types. And there are also very powerful open source AI models, which means that pretty much anybody could get involved. So we need a treaty between all the major economies, or even all the major countries of the world. There's just one problem. How would you enforce a treaty about how quickly to proceed with AI development? Researchers considered several angles in this paper called Computing Power and the Governance of Artificial Intelligence. They considered limiting compute, data, algorithms, or talent. But compute is the only area with the 4 properties they described that are necessary for effective governance. Right now, there's a lot of research into various governance techniques in the United States that the US could use specifically to limit other countries like China from training very large models. As far as I can tell, based on grants, this research will be carried out for the next 12 to 18 months, and it's being done mostly for selfish reasons. The US wants an alternative from banning GPUs entirely from being sold to China. After all, I guess you can still make money selling GPUs to China as long as you know that no one's stockpiling them and training huge frontier models. And of course, China could catch up in terms of hardware. It's looking like there'd be relatively long time horizons on that. But the US doesn't want to find itself in a situation where it is banned from accessing all new GPUs, essentially. However, even though this research is being carried out for somewhat selfish reasons, it doesn't really matter. It's enabling the capability to have coordinated action between companies and between governments. It's giving us a way to stop Moloch, in other words. And I'm sure there will be a need for this in the future as companies or other governments realize how much trouble they're in because of this race. So that's why I'm really optimistic about this research actually getting carried out, especially because trade between the US and China is not a zero-sum game. Everybody has this idea that trade in geopolitics is always a zero-sum game, meaning that if somebody gains something, someone else has to lose something. Because, the thought goes, you're competing over finite resources, right? But actually, these days, you're competing mostly over economic resources, which are not zero-sum. Value gets created all the time, whenever someone invents a new way to be productive. Whenever GDP has grown faster than inflation, that's exactly what's happening. In fact, the biggest problem here is not that everything is zero-sum, but that it's very difficult to trust other people's word. So let's talk for a bit about game theory. The most commonly known problem in game theory is called the prisoner's dilemma, and it's also closely related to zero-sum games. In the prisoner's dilemma, you have 2 prisoners that have supposedly committed a crime together. The 2 prisoners can either cooperate with each other and not rat out their colleague, in which case nothing can really be proven about them, or they can defect and tell everything they know about their colleague. Defecting means that you get better treatment, but the other person is punished. And worst of all, if both sides defect, then you just both get punished. The optimum reward for both prisoners is that they should just cooperate. However, because these prisoners are isolated and there's no communication between them, if you assume the other person cooperates, it's strictly better for you to defect because you'll be treated better. But similarly, if you think the other party will defect, it's still better for you to defect. The individual incentive for each prisoner, in the absence of future interactions with the other prisoner, the best case is to backstab. In other words, the Nash equilibrium is defect-defect. This is what happens when Moloch has you in his trap. There's another problem in game theory, though, which is called the Stag hunt. In this situation, you have two hunters who have agreed to hunt a stag together, which apparently involves both of them sitting and waiting for long periods of time in different locations. Don't ask me, I don't know anything about hunting deer. While they are waiting, each hunter sees a rabbit spring up out of the bushes. The rabbit doesn't provide as much food, but it's easy for them to catch, including on their own. If either of the hunters decides to go off and chase the rabbit, then they'll get food for themselves, but the stag hunt will fail. And the greater payoff of a successful stag hunt will not happen. In this game, there are actually two Nash equilibria, which means two situations in which both players would not want to change their outcome. Either they both cooperate or they both defect. In other words, if the other party keeps their word, it's better for you to keep your word. But you don't actually have any way to check and see if they're keeping their word. So it's basically a communication problem. This is also known as the assurance dilemma. Both parties cooperating is a better outcome for both of them, but if you don't trust your opponent, you might be tempted to defect instead because you have no assurance. In other words, the parties need visibility into each other's actions so that they can actually check that they're adhering to agreements. If they are, then this cooperate Nash equilibrium will actually be where the game stays. And the assurance dilemma, or the stag hunt, is actually a much better model for what's going on when you have a treaty between, for example, the US and China. If both parties are cooperating, then both of them are happy with that. They wouldn't want to change their action to defect, assuming the payoff is higher for when they're cooperating. Contrast that with the prisoner's dilemma, when if you have both of them cooperating, then each prisoner would look back at the situation and say, "Aw man, I should have defected." Moloch induces a prisoner's dilemma. Each party wants to defect because it's strictly better for themselves. But a treaty is not a prisoner's dilemma, it's actually a stag hunt. You might wonder, why do people collaborate at all? Well, we usually collaborate with each other in iterated games, meaning that if you have a long-term relationship with someone, then you cooperate with them now because you can expect them to later cooperate with you. But to cooperate in one-shot games, you have to be using a mental framework called an updateless decision theory. This allows you to commit yourself to actions in the future, even when at that future time they would be strictly worse for you. You can look up counterfactual mugging if you're curious. But I think this is an important concept in most people's moral codes. A promise is a promise. But the incentive to act just because you can, just because it's better for you, is a lot higher, of course, when there's immense economic or strategic value at stake. Long story short, though, if you have some way of providing assurance, then countries will stay in treaties if they're strictly better than the alternative. Part 3. Hardware-enabled governance. The goal of hardware-enabled governance is to have unhackable hardware features of GPUs, for example, that can be used to help enforce agreements between countries, something that can provide assurance to all parties. Unhackable is relative, of course. It's always going to be possible to hack something like this, but you can make the cost so high that it's not worth it. State-level threat actors have really crazy capabilities. For example, the ability to burn out a few dozen specific transistors in a microprocessor. So it's very complicated to design this type of hardware that can be resilient even against someone arbitrarily burning out transistors. But it's at least theoretically possible. There are a couple of approaches to this. Some are very simplistic, like having GPUs contact a licensing server whenever they turn on. Or slightly better would be to have an offline licensing server which provides licensed keys which you then give to a GPU so that it can run for a certain number of computations. I also saw proposals for GPUs to have a little GPS module attached to them which could report the location of the hardware. Or more realistically, have the GPUs report their approximate location based on network topology. The reality, though, is that anything that has to actively ping someone else over the network before it's allowed to run is basically a non-starter for countries other than the US. There's no way they could agree to this because the US could shut them down at any point, essentially, if the US is the one running those servers that say yes or no. The more sophisticated approaches are based on cryptography. For example, you can basically set up a blockchain of GPU permissions which can't easily be hacked, except possibly by using GPUs, which seems a bit circular, doesn't it? You could have some kind of distributed protocol where you have all the GPUs talk to each other and agree on the size of training runs that can be executed at that time. One really interesting idea is to hook into slightly higher on the stack so that you can view the model compute graph in advance. I'm told that this information is visible to each GPU, though I suspect that capturing it would be a lot harder than it sounds, but that would give full visibility into what training runs are going on around the world, while allowing them to be fully anonymized and subject to constraint as agreed upon by different countries via voting. That's why cryptography is so powerful. It lets you enforce arbitrary conditions of arbitrary complexity. Even something like this country is allowed twice as many GPUs as this country. This can allow development and growth of development, but continue to prevent an all-out arms race, with vast resources being spent by each participant. There are even instances of this in history that we could look back on, like the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, where the world powers of the time agreed to maintain specific ratios in the sizes of their navies, based on the approximate sizes as of the treaty. Britain, the US, Japan, France, and Italy agreed to keep their navies at a 5 to 5 to 3 to 1.67 to 1.67 ratio, and the treaty worked because there was assurance. The countries were able to spy on each other's shipyards and see how many ships were actually being constructed. Even today, it's very funny how old school governments are in this regard. They love the idea of physical inspection. For example, in the proposals where they have GPS coordinates somehow for every GPU, they're basically thinking, aha, then we can physically go to those coordinates and see how many GPUs are running. Just like when there's a nuclear deal and inspectors have to go and physically look at the equipment every so often. But more technological methods of governance don't actually need inspectors. They can be self-enforcing and much more transparent. You can get up-to-the-minute information instead of relying on the data that you collected during your last inspection months and months ago. Would this type of governance actually work? Again, if the benefits of cooperating are high enough and you actually have assurance, then I don't see why not. There are other examples of this. For example, the CFCs, or chlorofluorocarbons, that were destroying the ozone layer. An international committee of scientists warned everyone, and then there was the Montreal Protocol, which banned that, to which a lot of countries were signatories. Manufacturers stopped using CFCs pretty quickly, but also technological monitoring was set up to catch violations of this in the future. And sure enough, in China, for many years, there were some underground companies that were producing CFCs because it's cheaper to use CFCs than other chemicals when you're producing foam, apparently. But worldwide levels of CFCs were actually rising in a detectable fashion. And after some detective work, they figured out that it was coming from somewhere in East Asia. China started looking into it, found a bunch of companies violating it and cracked down on them, and now the CFC levels have been really low again for a couple of years. So the assurance dilemma seems to have worked out well in that case. Let's hope it could be just as effective for AI safety in the future. Finally, in conclusion, we talked about Moloch, who is the personification of a race to the bottom. Moloch's trap kicks in whenever you have a bunch of people competing for something and no overarching rules that they all have to abide by. If one party starts doing something that might have previously been considered unethical, but it gives them a competitive advantage, then everyone else has to start doing that too, or they will just be outcompeted. In the case of AI, you have AI labs that are located in the United States, but you also have lots of other companies in other countries that are interested in, already engaged in, frontier model development. And unfortunately, when you consider a group of different countries, there's no overarching way to introduce rules that will affect all the companies in those different countries, not at the level of granularity you would need. So you actually have to have some kind of treaty in place that all the countries agree to. And for that to work out in the long run, you want to avoid the assurance dilemma, which basically says, even if it's in everybody's interest to cooperate, if there's no way to trust but verify, in other words, see if somebody else is cooperating, then each individual party, each country in this case, might still be tempted to defect. Luckily, there is one way that we could have some assurance built into this international GPU treaty, and that is by having hardware-enabled governance, by putting certain features directly into the GPUs that can't easily be bypassed. The best examples envision leveraging cryptography to have a sort of global network or global blockchain amongst all the different users of GPUs. You could, for example, have everybody vote for and agree upon certain specific limits of how much compute this company or that country is allowed to use right now. And then the GPU hardware would enforce that. It would make sure that it's not actually engaging in training runs that are larger than the agreements. This provides a potential way out of that rat's race that we are currently in. Finally, I would like to thank David Dalrymple, who goes by Davidad, because I spoke with him at length when gathering information for this video. He's a professor in the UK and was the youngest person ever to enroll in an MIT graduate program. So I guess you could say he knows a bit about AI safety. But as always, any errors and omissions are my own. If you'd like to chat with me and other members of our community, make sure to join our Discord channel. And if you liked this video, check out this previous one I made where I talked about China, the US, and Taiwan when it comes to GPU production. Well, that's all I have for today. Thank you very much for watching. Bye.